The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine suburban street as Detective Sarah Chen pulled up to the Victorian home with its perfectly manicured lawn. Nothing about the cheerful yellow facade suggested the darkness that lurked within, but Sarah had learned long ago that monsters rarely advertised themselves. They wore masks, smiled at neighbors, and hid their true nature behind carefully constructed walls of normalcy. Rebecca Morrison had been one of those monsters. The case began on a cold February evening, when emergency responders received a frantic call from a woman screaming about an intruder. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Morrison, a beloved pediatric nurse at Riverside Children's Hospital. Her voice trembled as she reported finding her husband David unconscious in their home office, blood pooling beneath his chair. She described hearing glass shatter, footsteps running, and the terror of discovering the man she loved lying motionless on the hardwood floor. When officers arrived, they found Rebecca huddled in her neighbor's kitchen, wrapped in a blanket, her hands shaking as she clutched a mug of tea she couldn't seem to drink. Her eyes were red and swollen, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted the horror of the evening. Every detail seemed authentic. Every emotion appeared genuine. She was the picture of a traumatized victim, and not a single person who responded that night suspected she was anything other than what she claimed to be. David Morrison was rushed to Memorial Hospital in critical condition. The attending physicians gave him less than a 20% chance of survival. His skull had been fractured in multiple places, and there was severe swelling on his brain. The medical team placed him in a medically induced coma, hoping to reduce the intracranial pressure and give his body a chance to heal. Meanwhile, his wife Rebecca maintained a constant vigil outside his room, refusing to leave even to sleep, camping out in the uncomfortable waiting room chairs and accepting food from well-meaning friends who stopped by to offer their support. To everyone who saw her, Rebecca Morrison was the epitome of a devoted spouse facing an unimaginable tragedy with grace and strength. But Detective Sarah Chen saw something else, something that didn't quite fit. Rebecca Morrison had built her life on the foundation of compassion and service. She had spent 12 years working in pediatric intensive care, comforting frightened children and exhausted parents through the worst moments of their lives. Her colleagues described her as an angel, someone who always volunteered for the hardest shifts and never complained. She organized fundraisers for families who couldn't afford their medical bills and spent her days off visiting former patients to check on their recovery. Outside the hospital, she was equally admired. She coached her daughter Emma's soccer team, hosted neighborhood barbecues, and could always be counted on to bring homemade cookies to the local food bank. Her marriage to David, a software engineer who worked from home, seemed idyllic. They had been together for 16 years, married for 13, and to all outward appearances they were deeply in love. Their home reflected this supposed harmony. Family photos lined the hallways, showing beach vacations, holiday celebrations, and candid moments of laughter. David's home office was filled with framed pictures of Rebecca and their 9-year-old daughter Emma, positioned so he could see them while he worked. Friends would later tell investigators that David frequently spoke about how lucky he was to have found Rebecca, how she was his best friend and the love of his life. But beneath this carefully curated surface, a different story was unfolding. A story of secrets, lies, and a betrayal so profound it would shock everyone who thought they knew Rebecca Morrison. The initial investigation into David's attack followed standard protocol. Detectives interviewed neighbors, searching for anyone who might have seen or heard something suspicious that evening. They examined the supposed point of entry, a broken window in the laundry room, and collected evidence from the scene. At first glance, everything seemed to support Rebecca's account of a home invasion gone wrong, but Detective Sarah Chen, a 20-year veteran with an instinct for inconsistency, noticed troubling details that others had overlooked. The broken glass from the window had fallen primarily on the outside of the house rather than inside, suggesting it had been broken from within. The house alarm system had been deactivated at 6:37 that evening, well before Rebecca claimed the intruder had arrived. And perhaps most significantly, the family's 2 German shepherds, who were notoriously protective and vocal, had been found locked in the garage, calm and quiet, showing no signs of the agitation that would be expected if a stranger had invaded their home. Then there was Rebecca's behavior. While her performance of grief was convincing, there were moments when the mask slipped. During her initial interview at the police station, she had asked detailed questions about David's injuries and prognosis. But Detective Chen noticed she never once asked if he had said anything before losing consciousness. It was a subtle omission, but a telling one. A truly innocent spouse would want to know if their loved one had any final words, any message they were trying to convey. Sarah began digging deeper into the Morrison family's life, and what she found painted a very different picture than the one Rebecca had so carefully maintained. The financial investigation revealed the first cracks in Rebecca's perfect facade. Despite her job at the hospital and David's substantial income as a senior software developer, the Morrisons were drowning in debt. But this wasn't the normal accumulation of credit card bills and mortgage payments. This was a systematic pattern of financial deception that stretched back nearly 3 years. Rebecca had opened 17 different credit cards, many in David's name without his knowledge. She had taken out personal loans using forged documents, maxed out lines of credit, and even borrowed money from David's retirement account, carefully covering her tracks by intercepting the monthly statements before he could see them. The total amount missing was staggering, nearly $230,000, gone without a trace. Detective Chen brought in a forensic accountant, Marcus Reynolds, who specialized in tracking hidden expenditures. What he uncovered was both shocking and devastating. The money hadn't been spent on gambling debts or addiction. Instead, it had funded a completely separate existence that Rebecca had been maintaining for the past 2.5 years. She had rented a luxury apartment in the city under a different name, furnished it expensively, and used it as a private retreat where she met regularly with her lover, a man named James Whitmore. But the spending went far beyond just the apartment. Rebecca had purchased a new car, registered under an LLC she had created, and had been taking extravagant trips with James, telling David she was attending nursing conferences or visiting her sister in Portland. The most damning discovery came from Rebecca's hidden email account. Unlike the meticulous care she had taken to hide her financial transactions, her digital communications revealed a stunning lack of caution. Perhaps she had grown overconfident, or perhaps she simply couldn't resist documenting her secret life. Either way, the emails provided investigators with a roadmap of her true intentions. The messages between Rebecca and James painted a picture of a woman living a double life with no intention of giving up either version. She wrote to him about her frustrations with David, calling him boring and predictable. She complained that he was holding her back from the exciting, adventurous life she deserved. But more disturbingly, she wrote about her plans for the future, plans that explicitly did not include her husband. In an email sent just 6 weeks before the attack, Rebecca wrote to James, "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. You're right. Divorce would be too expensive and too complicated. I'd lose the house, and David would get joint custody of Emma. I need a cleaner solution, something that lets me keep everything while starting fresh with you. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I'll figure it out." "I always do." James's response was cautious, suggesting she was getting ahead of herself and that they should focus on the present. But Rebecca's follow-up messages showed a woman who had already made her decision. She began researching life insurance policies, checking to confirm that David's workplace policy was still active and that she was the primary beneficiary. The policy was worth $750,000, more than enough to pay off her debts and fund her new life. What chilled investigators most was the clinical, business-like tone of these discussions. Rebecca wasn't writing as a woman consumed by passion or desperation. She was planning David's death the way someone might plan a career change, weighing pros and cons, considering different scenarios, and calculating the most beneficial outcome. There was no anger, no emotion, just cold pragmatism. The turning point in the investigation came from an unexpected source, David's best friend, Thomas Bradley. Thomas had known David since college, and he came to the police station 3 days after the attack with information he thought might be relevant. He explained that David had confided in him about 6 weeks earlier, expressing concerns about their finances. David had discovered some irregularities in their bank accounts and had been planning to sit down with Rebecca to discuss them. He had scheduled that conversation for the evening of the attack. Thomas's testimony provided the final piece of the puzzle. Rebecca hadn't attacked David in a fit of rage or during a spontaneous argument. She had struck preemptively, eliminating him before he could uncover the full extent of her deception. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was calculated. With this information, Detective Chen obtained a warrant to search the Morrison home more thoroughly. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions. Hidden in Rebecca's closet, beneath a false bottom in a storage box, was a burner phone she had used exclusively to communicate with James. The text messages on this phone told a different story than the passionate but cautious emails. These messages were urgent, desperate, and damning. 1 week before the attack, Rebecca had texted James, "He knows about the credit cards. Not everything, but enough to start asking questions. I need to move up the timeline." James had urged caution, but Rebecca was insistent. "This is happening whether you're on board or not. I've come too far to let him ruin everything." The day before the attack, she sent one final message. "Tomorrow night. I've thought it through. It will look like a robbery. No one will suspect anything. By this time next week, we'll be free." The evidence was overwhelming. Rebecca Morrison had meticulously planned her husband's murder, motivated not by passion or fear, but by greed and the desire to preserve the secret life she had built on lies and stolen money. On the surface, Rebecca continued to play her role perfectly. She gave a tearful interview to the local news, describing David as her soulmate and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She posted daily updates about his condition on social media, thanking the community for their prayers and support. She even organized a GoFundMe campaign to help with medical expenses, which raised over $40,000 from sympathetic friends and strangers. But behind closed doors, Rebecca was beginning to panic. She knew the police had searched her house again, this time more thoroughly. She had noticed Detective Chen's increasingly pointed questions during their follow-up interviews, and she was aware that investigators had contacted her co-workers and friends, asking questions about her marriage and her recent behavior. Her lawyer, Patricia Hammond, was a skilled defense attorney who specialized in high-profile criminal cases. Patricia immediately recognized the precarious position her client was in and advised her to stop speaking to the police without legal counsel present. She also suggested that Rebecca cease all social media activity and decline any further media interviews. The public performance was only digging her deeper into trouble. But Rebecca couldn't help herself. Her narcissism demanded an audience, and the sympathy she was receiving from the community had become addictive. She continued to post updates, each one more dramatic and attention-seeking than the last. She shared photos of herself at David's bedside, her hand clasping his motionless one, her expression one of tragic devotion. She wrote long, emotional captions about the cruelty of fate and the strength of their love. Meanwhile, Detective Chen was building an airtight case. The forensic evidence, financial records, digital communications, and witness testimonies all pointed to the same conclusion. Rebecca Morrison had attempted to murder her husband in a premeditated attack designed to look like a random home invasion. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the attack. Detective Chen, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers, arrived at the Morrison home at 6 a.m. Rebecca answered the door in her bathrobe, her hair still damp from the shower. When Sarah informed her she was under arrest for the attempted murder of David Morrison, Rebecca's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, confusion, indignation, and finally, rage. "This is insane," she hissed as the handcuffs were placed on her wrists. "I'm the victim here. Someone attacked my husband, and instead of finding them, you're arresting me. This is incompetent police work, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." As she was led to the patrol car, neighbors emerged from their homes, watching in disbelief as the woman they had admired for years was placed in the back seat like a common criminal. Some refused to believe it, convinced there must be some terrible mistake. Others began to reconsider moments and conversations they had previously dismissed, seeing them now in a new and disturbing light. At the police station, Rebecca initially refused to speak without her attorney present. But as the hours passed and the reality of her situation began to sink in, her composure started to crack. Patricia Hammond arrived and huddled with her client, reviewing the evidence the prosecution had already disclosed. The lawyer's expression grew increasingly grim as she realized the strength of the case against Rebecca. During the formal interrogation, with Patricia seated beside her, Rebecca maintained her innocence. But her denials were less convincing now, lacking the passionate intensity of the early days. Detective Chen laid out the evidence methodically. The financial records, the emails, the text messages, the forensic analysis of the crime scene. With each revelation, Rebecca's face grew paler, her breathing more shallow. Finally, Detective Chen played her trump card. She revealed that they had obtained James Whitmore's cooperation. Faced with potential charges as an accomplice, James had provided a full statement describing Rebecca's plans and his own attempts to dissuade her. He had even handed over recordings of several phone conversations where Rebecca had explicitly discussed different methods of killing David and making it look accidental. The recordings were devastating. In one particularly chilling exchange, Rebecca laughed as she described her plan. "The beauty of it is that everyone sees me as this caring, nurturing nurse. No one will ever suspect that I could hurt anyone, let alone David. I've spent 12 years building this reputation, precisely for moments like this. It's the perfect cover." When the recording ended, the interrogation room fell silent. Patricia Hammond closed her eyes, recognizing that her client's defense had just collapsed. Detective Chen looked across the table at Rebecca, whose mask of innocence had finally shattered completely. What remained was anger, not at herself, but at the world for failing to let her get away with it. "You don't understand," Rebecca said, her voice cold and brittle. "I gave David the best years of my life. I pretended to be satisfied with his mediocrity, his small dreams, his boring existence. I deserved more. I earned the right to start over, and he was standing in my way. Everything I did was justified. It was a confession not of guilt, but of entitlement." Rebecca truly believed she had done nothing wrong, that her desires and needs superseded anyone else's right to life or happiness. The sociopathy that had been hidden beneath layers of charm and compassion was now fully exposed. Detective Chen concluded the interview and formally charged Rebecca Morrison with attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, fraud, and a host of other crimes. As Rebecca was led to her cell, she maintained her defiant posture, convinced, even now, that she would find a way to manipulate the system and escape true accountability. But the evidence against her was insurmountable, a digital and paper trail that documented every step of her deception. The case had cracked wide open, and the community that had once embraced her was now reeling from the revelation that they had harbored a monster in their midst. The trial of Rebecca Morrison began 9 months after David's attack, and it captivated the entire city. The courtroom was packed every day with spectators, journalists and members of the community trying to reconcile the caring nurse they thought they knew with the calculating attempted murderer described by E. Prosecutors. Lead prosecutor Daniel Ortega was a methodical attorney known for his thorough preparation and calm demeanor. He understood that the jury would struggle to believe that someone like Rebecca, with her background of service and compassion, could commit such a heinous crime. His strategy was to present the evidence in a way that showed the stark contrast between Rebecca's public persona and her private reality. The trial opened with victim impact statements from David's family. His sister, Michelle Morrison, spoke about the brother she had grown up with, a gentle soul who had trusted Rebecca completely. She described visiting him in the hospital during those early weeks, not knowing if he would ever wake up, and the pain of knowing that the person responsible was the woman he had loved unconditionally. David's elderly parents, both in their 70s, provided testimony that brought tears to many in the courtroom. His mother, Patricia, spoke about how Rebecca had been like a daughter to her, someone she had trusted with her son's happiness. The betrayal cut even deeper than the violence, she explained, because Rebecca had fooled them all so completely. Prosecutor Ortega then methodically presented the financial evidence. The forensic accountant walked the jury through the complex web of lies and theft, showing spreadsheets and bank statements that documented every stolen dollar. The numbers were staggering, painting a picture of systematic fraud that had been ongoing for years. Rebecca, watching from the defense table, maintained an expression of bored disdain, as if the proceedings were beneath her. The emails and text messages were perhaps the most damning evidence. When they were read aloud in court, several jurors visibly recoiled. The clinical, businesslike discussion of murder, the complete lack of empathy for David, and the narcissistic justifications for her actions revealed a person utterly devoid of conscience. James Whitmore's testimony was particularly difficult to watch. He took the stand looking haggard and remorseful, explaining how he had met Rebecca at a medical conference and begun an affair with her. He claimed he had believed her stories about being trapped in an unhappy marriage, about David being emotionally abusive and controlling. It wasn't until the weeks before the attack that he realized Rebecca had been lying about everything, creating a fictional version of her marriage to justify her actions. "She told me David was cold and neglectful," James testified, his voice shaking. "She said he ignored Emma, that he was financially controlling, that she lived in constant fear. But when I met him briefly at a charity event, I saw none of that. He seemed kind and devoted. When I confronted Rebecca about the discrepancies, she became angry and told me I needed to trust her. That's when I started to realize something was very wrong." James described the phone conversations where Rebecca had discussed her plans, his attempts to talk her out of it, and his horror when he learned David had been attacked. He admitted he should have gone to the police sooner, that his silence made him complicit, and he expressed deep remorse for his role in the tragedy. The defense's strategy, led by Patricia Hammond, was to paint Rebecca as a woman driven to desperation by financial pressure and an unraveling affair. They argued that while Rebecca had made poor choices and acted deceptively, there was no concrete proof she had carried out the attack. They suggested that James Whitmore, facing his own legal jeopardy, had fabricated or exaggerated Rebecca's plans to deflect blame from himself. It was a weak defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, too detailed, and too damning to be explained away by reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case reached its climax with the presentation of Rebecca's internet search history. A computer forensics expert took the stand and walked the jury through the defendant's online activities in the weeks leading up to the attack. The searches told a story of calculated premeditation. 6 weeks before, how much life insurance payout after spouse? Death. 5 weeks before, a best way to stage home invasion. 4 weeks before, how to knock someone unconscious without killing them immediately. 3 weeks before, how long until brain injury causes death. The expert explained that Rebecca had used both her regular computer and her burner phone to conduct these searches, apparently trying to avoid detection. But she had underestimated the thoroughness of modern digital forensics. Every search, every website visited, every page viewed had been recovered and documented. The final search, conducted just hours before the attack, was the most chilling. Recovery rates, traumatic brain injury, severe blunt force. Prosecutor Ortega paused after this revelation, letting the implications sink in. Rebecca wasn't just planning to hurt David. She was researching how to hurt him enough to kill him while potentially maintaining deniability. The searches showed sophisticated planning and a clear intent to murder. Rebecca's reaction to this evidence was subtle but telling. Her jaw clenched. Her hands gripped the edge of the defense table, and for a moment pure hatred flashed across her face. Not remorse, not shame, but anger at being caught. The defense attempted damage control, suggesting the searches could have been for a crime novel Rebecca was thinking about writing or research for a true crime podcast she enjoyed. But the jury's expressions made clear they weren't buying these explanations. The searches were too specific, too detailed, and too perfectly aligned with the actual crime to be coincidental. As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented witnesses who described Rebecca's behavior in the days and weeks after the attack. Hospital staff testified about her constant presence at David's bedside, noting that while she appeared devastated, she also asked unusual questions about his prognosis and brain function. One nurse recalled Rebecca specifically asking whether David might have memory loss if he woke up, and seeming oddly relieved when told that severe retrograde amnesia was possible with his type of injury. Friends and neighbors testified about Rebecca's social media activity and her efforts to control the narrative surrounding the attack. Several mentioned feeling uncomfortable with how theatrical her grief seemed, how she appeared to be performing for an audience rather than genuinely mourning. The prosecution also called Dr. Elizabeth Sawyer, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Rebecca. Dr. Sawyer testified about the hallmarks of narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits she had observed. While careful not to provide a definitive diagnosis, she explained how individuals with these characteristics often present a charming, caring public face while being utterly self-centered and lacking empathy in their private lives. These individuals often choose helping professions, Dr. Sawyer explained, because it provides excellent cover for their true nature. Being a nurse or a teacher or a counselor gives them access to vulnerable people and creates a public perception of compassion that makes it very difficult for others to believe they could be capable of violence or manipulation. The testimony painted Rebecca not as a woman driven to a desperate act, but as a calculating predator who had spent years cultivating a false image while systematically betraying everyone who trusted her. The defense called character witnesses who spoke about Rebecca's good works and dedication to her patients. Several parents of children she had cared for testified about her kindness and compassion. But under cross-examination, Prosecutor Ortega gently pointed out that none of these witnesses had any knowledge of Rebecca's private life, her finances, or her relationship with David. They had seen only what she wanted them to see, the carefully maintained mask that hid her true nature. Patricia Hammond knew her client's case was nearly hopeless, but she had one final strategy: attacking the reliability of the digital evidence and suggesting that James Whitmore had manipulated the communications to frame Rebecca. She called a technology expert who testified about how text messages could be fabricated and emails could be backdated. But the prosecution's rebuttal witness, a senior FBI forensic analyst, demolished this theory. He explained in detail how they had verified the authenticity of every digital communication, tracking metadata, cell tower pings, and IP addresses. The evidence was genuine, complete, and unmanipulated. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the prosecution prepared to present their most dramatic evidence. David Morrison himself would testify. David's survival had been nothing short of miraculous. After 3 weeks in a coma, he had begun showing signs of brain activity. Slowly, painstakingly, he had fought his way back to consciousness. His recovery was far from complete. He struggled with some memory issues, had difficulty with complex motor tasks, and suffered from chronic headaches. But he was alive, and more importantly, he remembered enough. The prosecution had kept David's recovery under wraps, allowing Rebecca and her defense team to believe he remained in a vegetative state. It was a strategic decision, designed to prevent Rebecca from tailoring her defense around his testimony or attempting to intimidate him. On the day David was scheduled to testify, the courtroom buzzed with unusual energy. Something significant was about to happen, though most spectators didn't know what. Rebecca sat at the defense table, appearing confident for the first time in weeks. She had convinced herself that without David's testimony, the prosecution's case, while strong, might still leave room for reasonable doubt. When the prosecutor announced their final witness, Rebecca's expression was one of mild curiosity, not concern. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors, and David Morrison walked in. The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Several jurors sat forward in their seats, and Patricia Hammond's face went ashen. But no one's reaction compared to Rebecca's. Her mouth fell open, her eyes widened in pure shock, and all color drained from her face. For several seconds she simply stared, unable to process what she was seeing. Then, as David walked slowly but steadily toward the witness stand, her expression shifted from shock to fury. Her carefully maintained composure shattered completely, replaced by undisguised rage. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No! This isn't possible." Patricia Hammond gripped her client's arm, trying to quiet her, but Rebecca jerked away, half rising from her seat. The judge gavelled for order, warning Rebecca that any further outbursts would result in her removal from the courtroom. She sank back into her chair, but her eyes never left David, burning with a hatred so intense it seemed to fill the room. David took the oath and sat down, his movements careful and deliberate. When asked to identify his attacker, he raised his hand and pointed directly at Rebecca. "My wife, Rebecca Morrison, attacked me in our home," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind it. "She hit me from behind while I was working at my desk, and when I fell, she continued the assault. I remember looking up at her confused and in pain, and seeing no remorse in her eyes, only determination to finish what she'd started." The courtroom fell absolutely silent as David recounted the events of that night. He described how Rebecca had seemed strange all evening, nervous and distracted. He explained that he had planned to confront her about the financial irregularities he'd discovered, but had decided to wait until after their daughter was asleep. "I never got the chance," he said quietly. "She didn't give me the opportunity to even ask questions. I think she knew I was getting close to the truth, and she had decided this was the only way out." Under Prosecutor Ortega's careful questioning, David described the attack itself and the horrifying moment when he realized his wife was trying to kill him. He spoke about his memories of lying on the floor, unable to move, hearing Rebecca move around the house, staging the scene to look like a robbery. He recalled hearing her footsteps approach, felt her check his pulse and heard her murmur, "Finally." Most devastating was David's testimony about the aftermath. He described waking up in the hospital, learning that weeks had passed and being told by police that his wife had been arrested for attempting to murder him. He spoke about the betrayal, the realization that the woman he had loved and trusted had been systematically destroying their life for years. "I trusted her completely," David said, his voice breaking. "I never questioned her, never doubted her. I thought we were partners, building a life together. Finding out that she had been lying to me, stealing from me, planning to kill me, it's destroyed something fundamental in my ability to trust. She didn't just try to kill my body. She killed the person I was, the person who believed in love and partnership." Patricia Hammond attempted a cross-examination, suggesting David's memories might be faulty due to his brain injury, that he might have confused dreams with reality during his coma. But David remained calm and consistent, and a neurologist testified that David's injuries wouldn't have affected his memories of the events immediately before the attack. The defense's attempts to discredit David's testimony fell flat. He was a sympathetic witness, a genuine victim, and his words carried a weight that no amount of legal maneuvering could diminish. As David stepped down from the witness stand, he paused and looked directly at Rebecca. Their eyes met, and in that moment the full weight of her crimes seemed to settle over the courtroom. This wasn't just attempted murder, documented in police reports and forensic evidence. This was a real person whose life had been shattered by someone who had promised to love and protect him. Rebecca stared back, and for just a moment, her mask of rage fell away, replaced by something even more chilling, complete indifference. She felt nothing for him, no remorse, no guilt, no sadness. He was simply an obstacle that she had failed to eliminate, and her only regret was being caught. With David's testimony, the prosecution rested its case. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to prove. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury had heard directly from the victim himself. The closing arguments were almost anticlimactic after the drama of David's testimony. Prosecutor Ortega methodically reviewed the evidence, connecting each piece to show the clear picture of premeditated attempted murder. He spoke about the careful planning, the systematic deception, and the cold calculation behind Rebecca's actions. Patricia Hammond did her best to create doubt, suggesting that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a jilted lover and a possibly confused victim. But her heart wasn't in it. She knew her client was guilty, and she knew the jury knew it too. In her final moments before the case went to the jury, Rebecca insisted on making a statement against her attorney's advice. She stood and addressed the court, her voice initially shaking but growing stronger as she spoke. "I am not the monster they've portrayed me as," she said. "I dedicated my life to helping children, to serving my community. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I had an affair and handled our finances poorly. But I never tried to kill David. The police needed someone to blame, and I was an easy target. This entire trial has been a witch hunt, and I refuse to apologize for crimes I didn't commit. It was a performance, one final attempt to sway the jury, but coming after all the evidence they had seen and heard, It rang hollow. Several jurors visibly recoiled, offended by her continued refusal to take any responsibility. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty. Rebecca's expression as the verdict was read was one of pure shock, as if she genuinely couldn't believe the jury had failed to be swayed by her charm and her denials. As the judge thanked the jury and set a date for sentencing, she turned to her attorney and hissed, "How is this possible? Didn't they see what I was saying? Don't they understand?" Patricia Hammond just shook her head sadly. Rebecca truly didn't comprehend that her lies had finally caught up with her, that no amount of charm or manipulation could overcome the mountain of evidence against her. 2 months later, the sentencing hearing brought David's family, friends, and members of the community back to the courtroom. The victim impact statements were heart-wrenching. David's sister spoke about the brother she had lost, not to death, but to betrayal and trauma that had changed him fundamentally. David himself provided a statement, speaking about the long road to recovery and the psychological scars that would never fully heal. He talked about his daughter, Emma, who had lost her mother to prison and nearly lost her father to murder, and who would grow up knowing the woman who was supposed to protect her had instead tried to destroy their family. "Emma asks me sometimes if her mother ever loved us," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to answer that. I thought Rebecca did. I believed we had something real. But now I understand that everything was a performance, a lie. Emma and I are learning to rebuild our lives, but we'll always carry this with us." When offered the chance to address the court before sentencing, Rebecca stood once more. Her attorney had begged her to express remorse, to show some acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Instead, Rebecca launched into a bitter diatribe about the unfairness of the justice system, the incompetence of investigators, and the betrayal of James Whitmore and others who had testified against her. "I was a good person," she insisted. "I helped people. I cared for sick children. I volunteered in my community. None of that mattered to anyone when it came time to judge me. You all wanted a villain, and you decided I would be that person. But I know the truth. I know what really happened, and someday everyone will realize they made a terrible mistake." Judge Harold Mitchell listened with an expression of barely contained disgust. When Rebecca finally finished her self-pitying speech, he leaned forward and addressed her directly. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his voice cutting through the courtroom, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have seen many defendants stand where you stand now. Some express genuine remorse. Some accept responsibility. Some maintain their innocence with dignity. But rarely have I seen someone so utterly lacking in self-awareness, so completely incapable of acknowledging the harm they have caused." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You didn't just attempt to murder your husband. You betrayed everyone who loved and trusted you. You stole from your family, lied to your friends, and used your reputation as a caregiver to hide your true nature. You showed no mercy to David, and I will show none to you." Judge Mitchell sentenced Rebecca Morrison to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole for 30 years. It was the maximum sentence allowed, and it ensured that she would be elderly before she could ever taste freedom again. As the bailiffs moved to escort her from the courtroom for the final time, Rebecca turned and looked back at the gallery. Her eyes found David, who sat in the front row between his sister and his parents. For a long moment their eyes locked. Then slowly and deliberately Rebecca smiled. It wasn't the warm smile she had shown her patients, or the loving smile she had shown her husband in happier times. It was cold, cruel, and utterly chilling. It was a smile that said she regretted nothing, that she still believed she had been right, and that given the chance, she would do it all again. The smile was her final message, her last act of defiance and cruelty. Then she turned and was led away, disappearing through the courtroom doors and into the prison system where she would spend the rest of her productive years. David watched her go, his expression unreadable. Later, he would tell his therapist that in that moment he felt not anger or fear, but a profound sadness. The woman he had loved had never really existed. She had been a carefully constructed illusion, a mask worn by a monster. And now both the woman and the illusion were gone, leaving only the memory of what he had thought they'd shared. The Rebecca Morrison case became a cautionary tale about the masks people wear and the monsters that can hide behind acts of kindness. It reminded everyone that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it smiles, volunteers at charity events, and bakes cookies for the neighbors. Detective Sarah Chen would later reflect that the case had taught her an important lesson, that the most dangerous predators are often those we trust the most, those who work hardest to appear trustworthy and good. Rebecca Morrison had used her profession, her community involvement, and her reputation as armor, a protective shield that deflected suspicion and allowed her to operate freely within the lives of those who never imagined she could hurt them. In the aftermath of the trial, the community of Riverside struggled to process what had happened. Parents whose children Rebecca had cared for in the hospital felt violated and confused. How could someone who had shown such tenderness to sick children be capable of such calculated violence? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the limitations of their own judgment. The hospital where Rebecca had worked for 12 years conducted an internal review, examining whether there had been any warning signs they had missed. They found nothing. Her performance evaluations had been exemplary, her relationships with colleagues positive, and her patient care beyond reproach. She had been, by all measurable standards, an exceptional nurse. The realization that professional competence and personal morality were not synonymous was a difficult pill for the institution to swallow. Emma Morrison, the 9-year-old daughter caught in the wreckage of her mother's crimes, became the focus of intense concern and support. David's sister Michelle and her husband took temporary custody while David completed his recovery, providing stability and love during an impossibly difficult time. Child psychologists worked with Emma, helping her process the trauma of losing her mother to prison and nearly losing her father to murder. The most challenging aspect of Emma's therapy was addressing her feelings about Rebecca. She loved her mother, had memories of bedtime stories and birthday parties, of soccer games and family dinners, but she also now knew that this same person had tried to kill her father, had stolen from their family, and had planned to abandon her entirely. The therapists worked carefully to help Emma understand that both realities could exist simultaneously, that her memories weren't false, but that her mother's love had been conditional and ultimately inadequate. David's recovery continued slowly. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological scars proved more persistent. He struggled with trust issues, finding it difficult to form new relationships or believe in the sincerity of others. He attended therapy regularly, working through the complex emotions of betrayal, grief, and survivor's guilt. There were days when he wondered if it would have been easier if Rebecca had succeeded, if death would have been preferable to living with the knowledge of her deception. But Emma kept him grounded. She needed him, needed at least one parent who was present and genuine. David threw himself into being the father she deserved, attending every soccer game, helping with homework and creating new traditions that belonged only to the two of them. They planted a garden together, something Rebecca had never been interested in, and watched it grow from seeds into something beautiful and real. It became a metaphor for their new life, a life built on authenticity rather than lies. The media coverage of the case was extensive and often sensationalized. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Armchair detectives analyzed Rebecca's behavior, and psychological experts weighed in on her motivations. Some painted her as a victim of societal pressure to be perfect, others as a born sociopath who had been mimicking human emotion her entire life. The truth, as David had come to understand, was probably more complex and more mundane. Rebecca had been selfish, entitled, and utterly lacking in empathy. She had wanted what she wanted and felt justified in taking it, regardless of who was hurt in the process. James Whitmore, Rebecca's lover, faced his own reckoning. Though he had ultimately cooperated with investigators, his initial silence and his affair with a married woman made him a figure of public contempt. He lost his job, his reputation, and most of his friends. He moved to another state, trying to escape the shadow of his involvement in the case. In interviews, he expressed remorse and claimed he had been manipulated, but the public had little sympathy. He had known Rebecca was married, had known she was lying to her husband, and had continued the affair anyway. His moral culpability, while not criminal, was undeniable. The Morrison home, once a gathering place for friends and neighbors, stood empty for nearly a year after the trial. David couldn't bring himself to return to the place where he had nearly died, where his marriage had been revealed as a fraud. Eventually he sold it, using the proceeds to buy a smaller house across town where he and Emma could start, fresh without the ghosts of the past, haunting every room. The life insurance policy that Rebecca had counted on to fund her new life never paid out. The insurance company, upon learning of her conviction, denied the claim based on the felony exclusion clause. The money that had motivated her crime, that had driven her to attempt murder, never materialized. It was a final irony that Rebecca, in her cell, had plenty of time to contemplate. In prison, Rebecca maintained her innocence for the first 2 years. She filed appeals, claiming ineffective counsel, prejudicial media coverage, and prosecutorial misconduct. Each appeal was denied. She gave interviews to journalists who would listen, spinning elaborate theories about conspiracies and frame jobs. But as the years passed and no new evidence emerged to support her claims, even the most sympathetic listeners began to lose interest. Her fellow inmates saw through her act quickly. In prison, where manipulation and deception were currencies of daily survival, Rebecca's particular brand of narcissistic charm held little power. She was isolated, viewed with suspicion and dislike by both inmates and guards. The persona that had served her so well in the outside world was useless here, and she had no authentic self to fall back on. By her 5th year in prison, something in Rebecca seemed to break. Whether it was genuine self-reflection or simply the exhaustion of maintaining her lies, she became quieter, less insistent on her innocence. She stopped giving interviews and ceased filing frivolous appeals. In a letter to David that he never responded to, she wrote a brief apology that was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging her crimes. It wasn't much, just a few sentences expressing regret for the pain she had caused, but it was more than anyone had expected from her. David never knew if the apology was genuine or simply another manipulation, a new strategy for a woman who had run out of options. He didn't particularly care. Whether Rebecca had truly experienced remorse or was merely tired of fighting didn't change what she had done, or the years of recovery he and Emma had endured. He filed the letter away without responding, focusing instead on the life he was building with his daughter. Detective Sarah Chen moved on to other cases, but the Morrison investigation remained one of the most memorable of her career. It had confirmed what she had long suspected, that the most dangerous criminals were often the ones who looked least like criminals. They were teachers and nurses, coaches and volunteers, people who used their positions of trust to hide in plain sight. The case changed how she approached investigations, making her more willing to look beyond surface appearances and trust her instincts when something felt wrong. The forensic accountant, Marcus Reynolds, used the Morrison case as a teaching example in his workshops on financial fraud detection. He showed investigators how to spot the patterns of hidden debt, unauthorized loans, and forged documents that had characterized Rebecca's theft. The case demonstrated that financial crimes were often precursors to violence, that people who were desperate enough to steal were sometimes desperate enough to kill. Prosecutor Daniel Ortega went on to win several more high-profile cases, but he often cited the Morrison trial as the one that had taught him the most about human nature. The stark contrast between Rebecca's public persona and her private reality had been a masterclass in deception. It had reinforced his belief that the most compelling evidence was often the simplest, the victim's own words, the defendant's own searches, the cold hard facts that couldn't be explained away by charm or tears. The Riverside community slowly healed, though the case left a lasting impact. People were more cautious now, less willing to take appearances at face value. The neighborhood watch meetings had better attendance, and residents paid more attention to the people around them, looking for signs of trouble beneath the surface calm. It was a loss of innocence, a recognition that monsters could live next door and smile while they plotted violence. Emma Morrison grew up carrying the weight of her mother's crimes. As she entered her teenage years, she struggled with questions of identity and inherited guilt. Was she like her mother? Did she carry the same capacity for deception and violence? Her therapists and her father worked to reassure her that she was her own person. that Rebecca's choices were not a reflection on her or a prediction of her future. In high school, Emma became an advocate for children of incarcerated parents, speaking at local events about the unique challenges they faced. She talked openly about her mother's crimes, refusing to hide or minimize what had happened. It was her way of taking control of the narrative, of refusing to be defined by shame or secrecy. She was determined to be everything her mother had pretended to be, honest, compassionate, and genuinely dedicated to helping others. David watched his daughter's transformation with pride and heartbreak. She was resilient, stronger than he had been at her age, forged in fire but not destroyed by it. She had taken the worst moment of her childhood and used it as fuel to become a better person. In her strength he found his own, recognizing that if Emma could face the truth of her mother's actions with such courage, he could continue his own journey of healing. Years later, when Emma was accepted to college with a full scholarship to study social work, David felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride certainly, but also a profound sadness for all that had been lost. Rebecca should have been there to celebrate this milestone, to see the remarkable young woman their daughter had become. But Rebecca had forfeited that right when she chose violence and deception over love and honesty. On the day David drove Emma to college, they made one stop first. They visited the memorial bench that had been placed in Riverside Park in honor of victims of domestic violence. David had funded it anonymously, wanting to create something positive from their tragedy. They sat together on the bench, father and daughter, survivors of the same storm. "Do you ever think about her?" Emma asked quietly, the first time she had mentioned her mother in months. David considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think about who I thought she was, the person I believed I married. I mourn that person, even though she never really existed. But I don't think about the real Rebecca much anymore. She doesn't deserve that space in my head." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I think about what I would say to her if I could. If she asked me how I was, if she wanted to know about my life, what would you say?" David asked gently. "I'd tell her I'm okay, that we're okay, that she tried to break us but she failed." Emma smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'd tell her that I'm going to help people, real people who need it, and I'm going to do it honestly. I'm going to be everything she pretended to be." David pulled his daughter into a hug, overwhelmed by love and admiration for this fierce, broken, healing person who had survived the unsurvivable. "You already are," he whispered. They sat on the bench for a while longer, watching the sun set over the park where Emma had played as a child, before her world had shattered and been slowly, painfully rebuilt. Then they got back in the car and drove toward the future, toward college and new beginnings, toward a life that was messy and imperfect, but fundamentally honest. Behind them, in a prison cell 2 hours away, Rebecca Morrison sat alone, serving her sentence and living with the consequences of her choices. She was no longer the center of attention, no longer the focus of media coverage or public fascination. She had become what she had always been beneath the mask, a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil often wears a familiar face. The perfect lie had been exposed, and the truth, painful as it was, had set its victims free. Not free from the scars or the memories, but free from the deception, free to build lives based on authenticity rather than illusion. In that freedom, David and Emma found something Rebecca had never possessed and never understood: genuine peace. The case files gathered dust in the archives of the Riverside Police Department, another solved case among thousands. But for those who had lived through it, the Rebecca Morrison case would never be just another file. It was a lesson learned in blood and betrayal, a stark reminder that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored, but that humans had a remarkable capacity to heal, to adapt, and to build new lives from the rubble of the old. Detective Sarah Chen sometimes drove past the Morrisons' new house, noting with satisfaction the well-kept lawn and the basketball hoop in the driveway, signs of normal life resuming. She never stopped, never intruded on their privacy, but she carried their story with her as a reminder of why she did what she did. For every Rebecca Morrison who tried to manipulate the system, there were victims like David and Emma who deserved justice and protection. The story of Rebecca Morrison became a case study in forensic psychology programs, examined for its insights into narcissistic personality disorder and the psychology of female killers. Students analyzed her behavior, her planning, and her complete lack of remorse, trying to understand the mind of someone who could compartmentalize so effectively. Some saw her as an anomaly, others as an extreme example of traits that existed on a spectrum in many people. But for David Morrison, Rebecca was neither a case study nor an anomaly. She was simply the woman he had loved who had turned out to be someone else entirely. And in accepting that truth, in letting go of who he had thought she was, he had finally found a measure of peace. The perfect lie had been his prison, and the truth, terrible as it was, had been his liberation. As the years passed and Emma graduated from college, started her career helping at-risk families, and began building her own life, David found himself thinking less about what had been lost and more about what had been preserved. They had survived. They had grown. They had become stronger and more authentic versions of themselves, and Rebecca Morrison, the woman who had tried to destroy them, had failed. Her perfect lie had crumbled, her carefully constructed facade had fallen, and she had been left with nothing but the truth of who she really was. In the end, that was the only justice that truly mattered, that the mask had been torn away and the monster revealed, unable to hurt anyone ever again. The perfect lie was over, and the imperfect truth had won.